guest because Eric knows really kind of the behind the scenes of a lot of the stuff that, it's really become folklore in wrestling. And one of the things that people talk about a lot, I guess there's a three-pronged question here for you, Eric, is when you talk about Hall and Nash, there's the talk that, and it's become really popular in the last few years, they got a raise or a bump, as they like to say, for not having the merchandise aspect built into their contract. They didn't get the big, thick statement that Rick even still gets to this day from WWE. Number two, that they got an additional raise because they thought, just because they were on deal sheets and Jim Ross did the angle on Raw in 96, that they were coming back as Razor and Diesel. And then number three, there was the talk about, Hall and Nash at the time, for whatever reason, having a favored nations clause, and anybody else who was hired, they got bumped up. What, if any of that, is complete BS and what's legit?
Guy, you just lost me. I didn't know any of that. Go ahead, Eric.
Again, let me preface this by saying, I'm pretty good friends with both Scott Hall and Kevin Nash.
Yes, sir.
At this point in time in my life, and I've been friends with them. Kevin and I have always had a very unique relationship. Scott, I've not been as close to Scott. When he was, even when I was working with him, we've since become close. I admire him for trying to overcome his issues. I understand, I think, a fair amount of what he's been through and what kind of led him into the direction that his life took him. So seeing that he's working really hard at establishing a relationship with his son and his children, I don't know. I respect it. So I see both of them like Rick does. I see him at autograph signings or whatever. So I don't want to say anything to put myself on the outside of that relationship. But I'm going to be honest.
Kevin and Conrad are really close friends.
You asked the question, and yeah. I hope that these guys will understand that I'm being as honest as I can be from my perspective. I don't remember the details of their individual contracts. I really don't. So somebody could pull one out and say, "See, Bischoff was lying through his teeth." I'm not trying to lie. I'm not trying to mislead. I'm telling you what I remember. Okay, from what I remember, they got deals that probably made them about the same amount of money that they were making with WWE when they left. Now, this goes back to the merchandise conversation we were just talking about. People will say, and I get this all the time to this day, "Oh, you're the guy that, if it wasn't for you, guaranteed contracts would have never happened." And by the way, sometimes they put me over for that. I didn't invent guaranteed contracts. When Rick came back to WCW when I was a third-string announcer, he got a guaranteed contract. I didn't write that contract.
Well, I had a guaranteed contract before I left.
Exactly.
Yeah, the guaranteed contracts came, as a matter of fact, a lot of people don't realize that Crockett had to start guaranteeing money.
With Luger.
With Luger, and when he did that, then the Road Warriors jumped in, and I jumped in real fast.
Yeah, and then when I was in a management position, and we'll talk more just about Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, these guys wanted to make the move. Part of it was financial. Part of it was they didn't like the pay system in WWE. Now, I don't know how it works. I'm certainly not going to say anything adverse to WWE, but it was kind of sort of discretionary at that time. The formula was a mystical kind of thing. You got paid kind of sort of where you were on the card, what everybody thought your contribution was. I mean, there was a formula there, but there was a lot of discretion involved in that formula as well. And the majority, and Rick knows this better than I do, the majority of the money that you would make in WWE back then, and probably to a large degree now, was based on where you were at the house shows, how many house shows you went to, how much merchandise you sold, what your involvement was in a pay-per-view, where you were on the card. There's a lot of formula that went along with that. In WCW, when someone wanted to come in, whether it was Ric Flair when he came back or Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, I couldn't say, "Okay, guys, well, look at this guy over here. Look at Van Vader over here. Last year, he made $300,000 a year just on T-shirt sales." If I said to someone, I'm going to give you Vince McMahon gives you whatever the percentage is, 5%, I'm going to give you 75% of all of your merchandise sales. Now, if that person had a half a brain or an attorney or a husband or wife, they would go, well, give me an example of someone who's selling a lot of merchandise. And then I would sit there and go, can't give you one, because we didn't have any. So the only way I could be competitive and pay people close to what they were making in WWE, and in some cases more, was to guarantee the contract. I couldn't share anything with them because there was nothing to share. We weren't making any money at that point.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I did guarantee, Scott and Kevin. And I don't remember what the number is, but I think it was like $750. I'm pretty sure it was when they first came in. And, yes, they were able to renegotiate when their contracts were up. But there was nothing that I recall that happened while they were in the middle of a contract that forced me or encouraged me to renegotiate and give them raises. When their contracts were up, yes, if things were going well, numbers were up, they were a big part of it. So, yeah, they probably got a raise. But it wasn't because anybody had a gun to my head or anything that Jim Ross did or any kind of backstage, manipulative. People like to talk about that because it makes themselves look smarter, it makes themselves look, knowledgeable about certain things. But, the reality is, yes, they got raises when their contracts came due.
So in October of 96, Ross tried to turn heel, so to speak, as his on-air character. And he said he's going to bring back Razor Ramon and Diesel.
Who are currently with WCW.
Right. Well, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were. Yeah. But WWE owned the intellectual property for the names.
That's why they were inducted.
So they brought a guy in named Rick Bogner and dressed him up like Scott Hall as Razor Ramon. And then they brought in Glenn Jacobs and dressed him up like Diesel. And we know, of course, a little later, Glenn Jacobs became Kane, and now he's a Hall of Famer. But at the time, that wasn't necessarily the case. They had tried him as Isaac Yankem, DDS, the Evil Dentist, and the whole deal.
Yeah.
So, but the talk is, for years and years, that they're watching the monitor backstage on Nitro, and out come the guys, and they realize that Eric had oversigned them. And supposedly the talk was he had paid them an extra $200,000. He had them on deal sheets at the time. This is the myth. This is the legend. This is the talk online. But he didn't have actual, ink on a contract. And so because of that, Eric was nervous and signed him for an extra $200,000. He just shot all that down. But before now, that's been like urban legend that everybody completely bought into. That he was.
I never heard that. God.
I've heard versions of that, and again. Look, did they each get a raise when their contracts were up? That I would rate that as a highly probable, but I also would unequivocally say it had nothing to do with fear. It had nothing to do with me buying into the bullshit. Sorry about that.
No, great. That's okay. Let it go.
Buying into the BS that. Jim Ross, was going to bring them back, and I was going to lose them, and I was afraid, so I gave them something that I didn't have to give them. That's a lot of the typical kind of nonsense that has evolved, as you said, in the urban legend of the wrestling business for over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
So what about favored nations? Is that a real thing?
I thought about that, in between our calls here. The only person that I can recall there are two people that I can recall that had favored nations in their agreements was obviously Hulk and Bill Goldberg, and that's because they shared an attorney. And Bill, when Bill started, he was making $75,000 a year at the power plant.
Yeah,
he wasn't making big money. It might have been more than I don't remember, wasn't it? But it was not big money. Okay, he didn't. Really get into the big money until after he had really blown up as a big star. And then Hulk introduced him to Henry Holmes, and then Henry Holmes introduced me to hell because he was negotiating with both of them, and Henry knew. Henry was very seasoned at what he could push and acquire. And Goldberg was hot as hell. So I'm pretty sure Bill got a favored nations agreement. I doubt that anybody else got one, but hey, if someone can, provide an agreement that says otherwise, I'll be happy to admit that I was wrong, but I don't think so.
Eric, while we're on the topic of contracts, there's a lot of talk that towards the end of WCW, and you may not be super familiar with this, but you may understand the concept of it. Why were there guys on Time Warner contracts instead of WCW contracts? You know, there's the talk online about why that was, but do you know that happened? And if so, what was the thought process behind it?
I have no insight into that at all. And to be honest, this is the first time that I've heard that.
I never heard that either.
Well, the concept was when WCW went out of business, you know, they didn't get everybody's contract. WWE, I mean, they. And so it was a deal where guys got paid to sit at home. So you've heard the story for years.
I'm one of them.
So, but the talk was that that would mean if you got paid to sit at home, that WWE didn't really buy your contract. You had a Time Warner contract, and Time Warner didn't go out of business.
Yeah.
WCW did. So if you had a WCW Entertainment contract, then that contract was sold to WWE. But if you didn't, then you were on a Time Warner deal.
That would be what Goldberg had, too, because he got paid.
Goldberg, Nash, Rick Steiner, a lot of guys.
Whoever. I mean, I don't know who it is, but I did have one of those. I didn't know it was a Time Warner.
You know what? This is the first time I've ever heard that there were two forms of a Time Warner / WCW contract. I certainly hadn't. That didn't occur well under my watch. Now maybe things changed later after 1999 when I left. But this is the first time I've ever heard that.
Well, it's probably because when WCW sold, they weren't in existence anymore. They just had.
Well, but WCW was a subsidiary of Turner Broadcasting, so it's not like WCW went bankrupt, which is another headline. That isn't really true. WCW was a wholly owned subsidiary of Time Warner and Turner Broadcasting.
Yeah.
So the contracts would have been. They would have been connected to Time Warner Turner Broadcasting. So just because Turner decided to shut WCW down didn't mean that their obligations under their contracts would have just gone away. They would have still had to continue paying those people.
Yeah, well, they did. I mean, I got paid. I mean, I ended up, when I went back to work for WWE,
You took a buyout?
I took a buyout, yeah. But it was, the WWE was generous enough to me at that point in time where it was worth it, and I was tired of sitting home. I was glad to go back and be on camera and all that. So,
and I'm guessing, again, I don't know. I wasn't involved in any of it. Nobody even had a conversation with me about it at the time. But I'm guessing that the WWE probably said at the time, okay, here's these guys that are under, Time Warner WCW contract. We can either bring them in or not. And I'm pretty sure, I would imagine that WWE just decided, it's not worth paying, a Bill Goldberg, whatever Bill Goldberg was making, a couple $1 million a year, whatever it was.
Yeah.
It's not worth bringing in certain people. They're not going to inherit that contract if they don't have to.
Yeah.
And some of those contracts probably look like, that's a reasonable deal. Let's inherit that one.
Yeah.
So my guess is it was more discretionary on the part of WWE than some kind of contractual advantage that certain talents had because they had